We've discussed three kinds of relationship between the sounds in a language. So the first is the relationship of contrast, that is, when two sounds are phonemes. And this describes a situation in which two sounds can appear in the same context in different words. Think of an example. So maybe ba and pa in English, where the voiced and voiceless contrast in in the initial environment. Allophones, two sounds that are never in the same context. They're predictable. Can you think of an example? Well, one example is one we just saw, where the dark and the clear L in English don't contrast, but are allophones of one underlying phoneme. Free variation, two sounds that occur in the same context but in the same word, never in different words. And that would be something like, well, say you're a speaker who sometimes says the plane and sometimes says the plane, then you would be a speaker who has variation between the and da in a particular environment. So an important thing though is that across context, two sounds can fall into different categories. That is, two sounds can be free variants in one context and allophones in another. So all these relationships are a little bit complicated. And just to make it even more complicated, we're going to introduce a fourth relationship today in our discussion of Boston R. So we spent some time in our discussion period talking about the contrast between ta and da in English. So these two phonemes contrast in every environment. They contrast word initially, they contrast word finally. They're realized differently in these different contexts. But where do they not contrast? Well, the contrast is neutralized in the flapping environment. So you can take a word with underlying ta and underlying da that would be contrastive, but then they would sound basically the same in the flapping environment. So I'll let you think about that yourself. An important caveat there, though, is that the vowels in those words sometimes are distinct. So this is the writer versus writer example that you may have come across already. We'll get into that in more detail later. So we're going to talk now about another familiar example of contrast neutralization. Familiar because it's in varieties that some of you speak, the Boston R. And the contrast here is between R and no sound at all. And phonologists will talk about an R0 alternation. In most environments, it's possible to construct minimal pairs. In most environments for Boston phonology, or Eastern Massachusetts phonology rather, it's possible to construct minimal pairs, but in some environments, the contrast between R and zero is lost. And the most familiar context in which it's lost is in what's the R deletion context. These examples are from a paper by UMass's own John McCarthy. In the first set, we have examples in which there's what's called R loss in the paper, or R deletion. So the spa seems to be broken, the spa seems to be broken. In my variety of English, I would say the spa seems to be broken and the spar seems to be broken. But in Boston English, which of course would have a lot of other differences in pronunciation, the contrast between the R final word and the word that doesn't have an underlying R is lost. He put the tuna down would be pronounced in the same way as he put the tuner down would be he put the tuna down. The boat seems to yaw someone older. So all of these are R deletion. So what's the context for R deletion? Where do we find R deletion? Think about that for a second. And you might have noticed that in all of these examples, the R is before a word that starts with a consonant, right? It can also happen phrased finally. When you have two vowels that come together in Boston English, in a number of in most speakers. Now, there's a lot of variation in this particular case, but for at least some speakers, um, there is R insertion or R intrusion. So you get the spar was broken. He put the tuner away. So that would be there would be an R no matter whether it was a vowel final word or a word that underlyingly started with R. And what's the context for R intrusion or linking? It's when there's a vowel initial word finally. So if you wanted to have rules to turn mainstream American English into Boston English, what would those rules be? And I'll ask you to write those down in a Blackboard answer. Another thing I'm going to ask you to take a look at on your own is this video piece from Slate that talks a bit about why the Boston accent is difficult for actors, including the stuff that we've just talked about. And you'll see when you watch all the way to the end that our own John McCarthy gets the credit in the end. In our earlier discussion, we talked in class, we talked about the fact that it seems to be the case that younger speakers delete R's less than older speakers. And here we have some research from now, 15 years ago, but that pattern was already being noticed then. So Irwin and Nagy in 2007, they studied read speech. So here people are talking about the blizzard of 1978. The participants were 24 lifetime residents of Boston, and it's noted that half of them lived in the working class neighborhoods of South Boston and Dorchester. The percentage here is the percentage of times the R was preserved in the deleting environment, and you'll see that you get a higher percentage of R being pronounced in younger women than women in the middle range of the age bracket. And then there's more pronunciation of the R than older women. Same pattern with men, and then there is also there's some difference between the men and the women. They also found an effective social group. So they found that people who had more education would tend to pronounce their R's. This probably doesn't come as a surprise to you. And they found an effective income, which relates to social group as well. Finally, they found interesting effects of phonological context. And this is something that we find in UK English as well, where, as you know, there is R deletion, that the R with different vowels has different percentages of deletion. So in the first example, this is the one that you get the most preservation, the nurse. So for some speakers, they'll pronounce the R in a word like nurse, but not in a word like start and nurse. Or they'll produce it more frequently in words like nurse. As we've seen already a few times in this course, R dropping is a feature of some, but not all varieties of British English. You're going to be listening to a word list spoken by native speakers of Belfast English, Edinburgh English, London English, as well as an RP speaker who's likely from London as well. I'd like you to listen especially to the words with final R, as well as to the intervocalic T's, that is how T, the underlying T, is realized, and words that have L in them, and see what you can figure out about the differences amongst these varieties of English. And also, I'd like you to comment on how what you found out here and elsewhere in the course relates to this map, which is showing the distribution of postvocalic R in varieties of UK English.